What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy. And again, if you're watching the video version of this, you can see that I'm still in my kind of hometown setup here in my dad's office. So I appreciate you all bearing with me as I record this podcast out of this very cold room in California. It is kind of weird covering football in January from a college football perspective, where everything is kind of over now, barring the national championship game that's later this evening. Everything is kind of in a standstill. Now, you do have an earlier offseason in college football, which I very much appreciate because after about a month and a half of downtime, I start to get a little antsy. And Tulane spring camp started relatively early last year. I recall it being almost 2 weeks earlier than a lot of other programs, but they had a lot of turnover last season on Tulane's coaching staff and within the players. And you really apply that 10, if not 20-fold, that's probably not a word, to what we're seeing this offseason, where, again, Tulane reached the highest mountaintop of success, then they sustained that success, and then they dealt with the pitfalls of what happens when you sustain said success. You oftentimes lose players, you oftentimes lose your head coach, and as we're seeing, especially as Tulane's coaching staff begins to shape out, that really kind of leads to a domino effect at that respective program. And we saw that mass exodus kind of happen with Willie Fritz going over to Houston, them taking several of Tulane's coaches, and then some other coaches like Gerald Chapman, the defensive line coach, going over to Florida. You have a lot of replacing going on there. But what's continued to stick out to me for Tulane is, yes, you have guys that transferred. You have Chris Brazel transferring to Tennessee, DJ Douglas transferring to Florida, Devin Deal and Heath Cooper, who we've already talked about, going over to Houston and TCU, respectively. But all things considered, you really would expect kind of more when you're looking at what's going on here when it's a G5 program. And a lot of G5 programs have not benefited from the transfer portal. Tulane, to me, has continued to benefit year after year. They really benefited in filling out what sticks out to me as the secondary this season before this last one, bringing over Larry Brooks and Lummy Young and filling out that room. And then you saw how important that was when they brought over Cam Pettislow this season, and a lot of key depth pieces like AJ Hampton, who stepped in several times at cornerback and played in the Military Bowl when Jarius Monroe sat out. And it's just hard to imagine what Tulane's roster would look like without being able to benefit from the transfer portal. And since I've kind of joined the college football realms, safe to say that it is entirely different than the NFL in so many ways I've talked about throughout several podcast episodes. One that sticks out to me really being style points and the importance of those. And when you get to a higher level, it doesn't matter if you win a football game by 1 point. Everyone only cares about your win-loss record. There is no discussion about quality wins, quality losses. There is no ranking system to be had outside of the wins, loss, and tiebreaker column. And it is kind of refreshing to just switch back over to that for this last weekend, kind of watching all the NFL games and realizing it doesn't matter what your perception of a single one of those teams was. All that mattered was the final score on that day, unless they were, knocked out or their seating was already locked up. But all that to say, all that matters is a W or an L. College football, I've learned, is certainly not that simple. And I almost wish that we could get a little closer back towards it. But with all of the disparity in conferences, I see that it is kind of somewhat of a necessary evil. And then you have the COVID year that is still kind of reverberating. I don't know how many guys still have that eligibility year, but it's hard not for me to also see a domino effect in that aspect when you look at guys that came in 2021 who didn't get that extra year of eligibility, nor are they kind of getting pushed out of a lot of rosters. And so I think there's just a spillover effect going on all over college football right now, where every program is kind of dealing with that super senior COVID year. And maybe it's gone now. Like I said, I'm not good at mental math. And that's when it's just arithmetic. And in college football, with all these extra years of eligibility and grad transfer rules, it's really hard to kind of get your head wrapped around everything. But I just see teams either really going with the transfer portal, adapting with it and using it to their advantage and not getting too mad about the unavoidable portions of it, or kind of just bulking at all of these changes in college football. I don't really see that going well for a lot of programs. I think we've seen a lot of transfer portal experiments. I don't know if all of them paid off. I just continue to look over at Colorado, and it's more interesting to me this season than it was last season. Granted, it was happening over at Colorado last year, but they brought in a new coach, this new regime, and it was this idea of cleaning house. And I don't really know what kind of message that sends to anyone on the team, to be honest with you. I don't think it bodes well for scholarship players that stick around, knowing that, one change or next year they decide to clean house all over again. It's just really hard to kind of feel like you have a place in a program. And then just expecting guys that have never played together before to all assemble together and form a cohesive unit. I mean, again, just tying back to the NFL, you think about how important veteran presence is on so many teams and how that really balances out those rookie talents that you bring in. It's the same kind of thing in college. It's just a lot more difficult nowadays where contracts don't really exist in the way that they do in the NFL. Maybe that's something that we're moving towards. I know there's all this talk about unions and what have you, but I just think that you work with what you can for now. And for Tulane, I just think about the fact that, they made it through probably the toughest stretch of what would be a bad situation for them in terms of going 2-10 that season and having generational talent on the roster like Tajay Spears and NFL draft prospects like Dorian Williams and Nick Anderson and all of those guys that went on, and all of them sticking around and then going. And I just think about the fact that, I was watching 2 games yesterday where I know these guys on the field in Tajay Spears and Dorian Williams having a key block on special teams in that Bills game that led to the game-winning punt return for a touchdown by Deontay Hardy. And then Tajay is just balling out and had 2 touchdowns in a 1-score game that didn't mean anything to Tennessee, meant a lot to other AFC teams in the playoffs. And just with the idea of Derrick Henry moving on next year, you're really looking at Tajay as kind of being the future of that running back room for Tennessee. And that's a really, really good sign for Tulane to have 2 guys come out of last year's group and be 3rd-round draft picks that saw the field in considerable ways this season and played well at that. I mean, it shows that there is a path to getting drafted at Tulane. And now we're going to really see that kind of spread out this season with all these guys that are getting invited to all these different bowls. And I think what these guys are going to benefit from this year is the benefit of the doubt that I don't know if all of the Tulane players were necessarily awarded consensus-wise last year. I think that there are scouts and teams that pay attention and scout G5 programs better than others do. I think a lot of them just kind of get stuck with that shiny toy idea and really kind of limit themselves. And maybe it's not always a 1st-round draft pick coming out of the G5, but they certainly are. I mean, Marcus Davenport for the Saints and Peyton Turner, I don't know necessarily if those are great examples, but they both came out of UTSA and Houston, which yes, is now a Power 5 program, but it wasn't when either of them were drafted. And those are just the 2 off of the top of my head. But you have to show that there's a path to getting drafted at your school. And it still sticks out to me. I did this earlier episode. I believe it was on the transfer portal way back in the day in this offseason. And I remember reading these things on the NCAA's website of expectations and what those expectations really translate to for these players. And it stuck out to me that most, if not all of them, wanted a path to getting drafted in the NFL. I mean, dream big. I don't know why you wouldn't, but think that there's a sense of realism that I don't know if it's possible for 17, 18-year-olds to be able to grasp, where it's either 0.1 or 0.01%. Either way, the odds are not in your favor. That's the amount of guys out of however many play in the NCAA on a given year that are draft eligible that actually make it to and play in the NFL. So all of that to say, every guy that makes it to the NFL kind of has to feel like they're the exception and not the rule. And that's just kind of what happens. But it's really hard balancing those expectations with the expectations of dreams. And I think that's what the epitome of college football is, where it might not be that realistic to be able to get drafted, but crazier things have happened and it's easier said than done for guys to give up on their dreams. I mean, you just look at Nick Anderson still balling out, trying to find a pathway to the NFL, knowing that he has a hell of a resume to fall back on if all else fails, including coaching up one of the best position groups in the Military Bowl that led the team in number 1 and 2 in tackles in that linebacker group for Tulane. But it just is not that easy. And to get there is one thing. To make it onto the field is an entirely different thing. I don't even know if they have statistics for that. And then to play well when your card is called, you see guys not rise to the occasion, I think, more often than you do. And it's safe to say that Dorian Williams and Tajay Spears have really risen to the occasion in the NFL this year. But now those guys are kind of the building blocks for the Tulane players going into this year's draft, where prior to that, you were looking at guys from several seasons prior that were a 1-off, a 2-off in draft classes. Now you have 2 third-round draft picks from the year prior. And yes, Tulane didn't win the Cotton Bowl this year, but there's only so much success that G5 programs can reach. And again, we're talking about 2 losses on the year that unfortunately were in those 2 most consequential games. Guess you could argue the SMU loss really being the most consequential one of the year. But the fact of the matter is you either win the conference championship or you lose the conference championship. That applies to every single game on the year. But that's just how it goes. And then the Military Bowl was just an uphill battle from the start. I really covered that in my last episode and just kind of throwing that in the trash, to be honest with you. Whereas I think, yeah, if Tulane had won and won in a strong way, there would be something to at least talk about. And you could look at some of the returning players and see what they did well. But it's really hard to parse that all out of a rainstorm, just complete deluge, especially in that second half. And having the injuries that they had, having the opt-outs that they had, having the coaching staff be what it was, there's just really not that much more meaningful things to derive out of that. What I find a lot more valuable is kind of looking forward at this point. And I know I keep saying this, but the future is really bright for Tulane. And I know that the college football playoffs is not the end all be all, but when we're talking about these expectations of these kids, to be able to say you have an opportunity to come play on this roster and have a path to the college football playoffs, most Power 5 teams really can't guarantee that. And yeah, you can't guarantee it to anyone, but looking at who Tulane's competition is for that G5 spot next year, I agree with the consensus that Troy would probably be top of the conversation. If John Sumrall and all of those coaches had stayed over there, it would really have depended on who Tulane hired. And it always depended on who Tulane hired. But you don't have SMU in the conversation because they're over in the ACC now with a whole other mess going on with Power 5 revenue. And I could talk a little about that, but I don't really know enough about the situation to know if SMU just kind of didn't read the dotted lines quite that well or expected something that wasn't totally promised to them, or if they're just getting screwed. I think it's safe to say that it's a clear shot at all of the above. Either way, they're not in the discourse next year for that college football playoff spot. You have Liberty, and I went back and forth. I think a win would have just helped G5 perception in general, but I think it just really shows how impressive, again, Tulane's Cotton Bowl win was last year, and with the resources that G5 programs have. And yes, the New Year's Six bowl game was always a really good thing to shoot for, but it's not as exciting as the college football playoffs, especially with that opportunity to win and continue on. It might not be, again, that realistic, but neither was Tulane coming back in the Cotton Bowl in the last 4 minutes in the way that they did. But I just think it changes the way that you can recruit, that you can bring guys in from the transfer portal. I think it completely changes the conversation when you're talking about the highest mountaintop no longer just being that New Year's Six bowl spot for that one final win, but a path to compete in the college football playoffs. And it helps Tulane's perception in that matter that they have been able to credibly beat Power 5 teams over the last few years, including in that biggest stage. Yeah, they didn't beat Virginia Tech, but again, just how much you derive meaning from that game. What they have beat since I've been there, yeah, they didn't beat Oklahoma, but they pretty much showed that they could go toe-to-toe with them without question. And then 2 seasons ago, beating Kansas State on the road, and then beating the entire slew of teams that were going off to the Power 5 in Houston. Yes, they went 1-1 with UCF. They beat them in the more important game. And Cincinnati, snapping the road streak that they did over there, or the home streak for Cincinnati, and then beating USC in the Cotton Bowl. That's pretty much as you could ask for. And then playing Ole Miss, it being a 3-score game until there were like 2 or 3 minutes left in that football game. It sucks when games really get out of hand at the end. But I think anyone that watched that, including a lot of Ole Miss fans, really respected how well Tulane could compete in the trenches. And I think the trenches is really where this conversation kind of starts and ends for me when you're talking about being able to compete against Power 5 programs. So I just go back to that Ole Miss loss in the 21 year, and Tulane just looked outmanned. Pound for pound, we're just bleeding out on the field, for lack of a better term. It was an ugly rain game where Nick Anderson broke his leg fairly early on in that matchup, but you just watch replays of that team, and the game speed just looked super slow for Tulane, and their ability to get any pass rush generated or keep Michael Pratt protected whatsoever. None of that was there. And then none of the rest of the game really matters if you don't have the ability to protect your quarterback or rush the other team's quarterback, because eventually receivers are going to get open in coverage. It's just how it works. And so watching Tulane really go toe for toe in the trenches against Ole Miss this last year was a really, really strong sign for me. And they have a very credible resume going into this next season. I think it's a fair discussion among some some G5 programs of the benefits of scheduling these tougher matchups. I think the question is whether or not you really think your team can win. And I think Tulane very credibly thinks that their team can win these Power 5 matchups because they have legitimate precedent over the last couple of seasons. And even in those losses, showing that they really battle like warriors. I mean, in the 3 losses of Oklahoma and the 2 Ole Miss losses, 2 of those were as quality losses you could ask for. I say that with air quotes on the video, just because the term is still so weird to me. But being able to go up to Oklahoma, which I'm excited about because I missed the first time they went up there. I was evacuated to Florida with my mom during Ida, joined the team for Legion Field, playing Morgan State in week 2 of the 21 year. So I'm excited to kind of get that experience that I didn't have my first season. And then Kansas State is always going to really hold that kind of special meaning, I think, for Tulane fans, for this team, for myself. I just think back to how wild of a sideline that was. And as a defense lover, how hard of a hit every single 4th down stop really was at Kansas State. But it'll be very interesting to see how Tulane continues to handle these Power 5 teams at home and whether or not they're still these road warriors or have more of a home presence, or if it's a little bit of somewhere in the middle of that, where Tulane really thrived on the road these last couple of years. And I think that the fan support has really come around for Tulane. But talking about, and I talked about the perception of these draft players for guys like Michael Pratt, Lawrence Keys, Jaquan Jackson, Lance Robinson, Jarius Monroe, Valentino Ambrosio. I'm just going to keep listing them all off. Having the benefit of the guys that came before them, I think that that's just going to be a continuous trickle-down effect. And I've totally lost my train of thought here. And we're just going to get into more of this on this episode of Before the Whistle. It's easy to hear a promo in the middle of a podcast and think, of course they like the product, they're paid too. Well, if you know me at all, then you know 2 things. 1, I'm truthful, almost to a fault. And 2, if I were in it for the money, well, then I'd be doing something else. So believe me when I say that I love Blue Oak Barbecue and I continue to miss it from afar. The food, the drinks, the people, the location, yes, all of that. Blue Oak Barbecue has a great selection of your favorites, from the smoker, fantastic sides, and awesome bar specials each and every week. Check them out. Blue Oak Barbecue, 900 North Carrollton Avenue in New Orleans, or you can visit them online at blueoakbbq.com. I have remembered my train of thought, a memoir. I was talking about how I just think back to 2 seasons ago. I have to get a better kind of way to break this down, but thinking back to the Memphis homecoming game where Tulane was really making a run for it. And Tajay's out there asking people to go on TulaneTix.com, that it would be cool to look up in the stands and see everyone cheering back when he scored a touchdown. And I just continue to think back on how ridiculous, especially in the light of what we've seen him do for his NFL career. Y'all really missed out on watching some true NFL talent if you weren't following along with Tulane that season. But it took a long time to really get fans behind the idea that Tulane was a successful football team. And I think this last season really went to show that that's something that they're really building momentum off of. I don't know if the ticket policy necessarily worked out in Tulane's favor, but having to implement one at all just goes to show that there was actually some interest. And I know things really got out of hand for the Ole Miss game. Hopefully we use that as a blueprint to get things together for this Kansas State game this year. But what I'll always just remember is that conference championship game where there were floods going on that morning all across New Orleans, and the fans still showed out. The student section filled up, and people were around buying tickets for students to be able to attend that game. And that really just went to show me how much momentum Tulane's really building. And I think it's just continuing on with a coach, again, that gets it and bringing this team together, bringing in the star power in the transfer portal. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this team shapes up. But they have a really strong argument if they win those games next year to be really just the fast track team onto the college football playoffs. And I would kill to be a fly on the wall for these recruiting meetings, just because I think the conversation has entirely changed. And you have to think that that's something that really motivated John Summerall to come over to Tulane, is the legitimate ability to compete in the college football playoffs, because money talks. And that's really, to me, the biggest discrepancy. When we're talking about, said I would maybe touch on this SMU stuff, but the idea, I think, is the issue is that they thought they would be receiving a portion of the payout for the college football playoff revenue that all G5 or Power 5 programs get. And that doesn't seem to be what everyone's necessarily decided on, but goes to show, I mean, it's a $5 million payout versus a $1 million payout. That's 5 times the amount of money. So if you're a G5 program, you have to be able to find those funds from within, from your NIL program. And Tulane has always just really been on top of the 8 ball with NIL, and that really has shown in their ability to retain and bring in all of these players. It showed in their ability to retain players last year, like Michael Pratt. There are deals going on, NIL deals, not shady ones, but you have to be able to pay players in this day and age. And so to be able to bring over a quarterback in Ty Thompson, because let's just kind of look forward to the future of the Wave now, where again, I mentioned that I'm at my dad's house. I'm on my laptop. I don't have my giant computer screen. So my ability to take and read off of my notes is a little hamstringed here, but I just felt like it would be helpful to do a roundtable of all of the changes, especially at the coaching staff, and then kind of break those down as these months go on, because I know everyone's kind of thinking, or maybe not, but just me, it's a football podcast. How do you keep that kind of running when there is no football to be talking about? And, I've kind of focused a lot more on college football in the offseason. I might go back to my kind of philosophical discussions among the NFL and just coaching traits and the like, just because I think it's helpful to be able to look at, again, what works and how coaching trees kind of develop and how you could start to see them kind of formulate even down in the college world, and what principles and philosophies really seem to matter and which ones are just kind of buzzwords. But I think it's helpful to go through all of these coaches, look at a lot of tape. I just haven't had the ability, but I would like to look at what I could see from Ty Thompson, look at Troy's offense and defense, because that's really where a majority of this new coaching staff is coming from. So let me pull up that and just break those down for right now. And there's a ton of players to talk about, and there's a lot in that like, but let's talk about who Tulane loses. So they lose Willie Fritz at head coach. They lose their defensive line coach, Gerald Chapman. He goes over to Florida. You lose your wide receiver coach and Derek Sherman. He goes over to Houston. You lose your defensive coordinator in Sheil Wood and your linebackers coach at Sheil Wood over to Houston, Josh Christian Young, the safety defensive back coach, one of the defensive analysts, Kurt Hester at strength and conditioning coach. I don't know if I'm forgetting any coaches at this point over to Troy, but it's a lot of holes to have to replace. I don't know if Slade Nagel is coming back, but considering that they've kind of hired a tight end coach, I believe, and an offensive coordinator, it's hard for me to kind of see where he fits in there, but it's all kind of up in the air at this point. But in terms of what Tulane has replaced, so again, you had to replace Gerald Chapman at defensive line. He went over to Florida, and to see what he did with the defensive line this year was just incredible. Just their ability to get to the quarterback, those 5, there were multiple sacks in the first couple games of this year. And yeah, you suffer some injuries along the defensive line, and that makes it really difficult. But Tulane has a lot of depth on the D-line. Now they're losing some of that, but retaining guys like Cameron Hamilton, Patrick Jenkins, Angelo Anderson. I mean, those are starters and key contributors on that line. Your interior in Cam Hamilton and Patrick Jenkins was elite. And that's really huge to be able to retain those guys. But I'll be curious to see what the new defensive schemes are, because there's been really such a huge change over the last 2 years, going from Chris Hampton's kind of zone style defense to a little more aggressive, switching to man coverage style in this last season. And didn't always work out, but I think that kind of huge switch over takes a little time. It really comes down to communication in your defensive back room, especially for the ability to switch all those different coverages. And Tulane's going to have to be dealing with a lot of turnover at that position group as well, with the amount of guys that are either out of eligibility and they're all going on to the draft. I don't know if they're going to bring in anyone additional, but who they have retained, that is one of those huge key retained coaching staff, is JJ McCleskey, who has been with the defensive back room since I've been here and just has such strong footholds in New Orleans in the recruiting landscape that was just such a key to be able to hire. And you just hear about how all of the guys talk about JJ McCleskey. And I mean, I really love JJ McCleskey. I've had really great conversations with him. He answers a lot of my questions just about defense in general. And it's just been such a helpful sounding board for me at times. So I'm really happy that he's being retained. You're also keeping Coach Sheridan, Carter Sheridan. He was coaching running backs this last year. Safe to say that he passed the test between Mekhi Hughes and what he was able to do with that running back room, but wide receivers are his more natural role. He spent time over at LSU and the Saints, where he primarily coached wide receivers. So he'll be taking over for Derek Sherman, who's going on to Houston and coaching that wide receiver role. You're also retaining Dan Rochar on the offensive line. And yeah, the offensive line struggled at times this year, but I've gone over just the amount of astonishing injuries that offensive line suffered throughout the year. It'll be really curious to me this year, though, because they're going to have to replace Sincere Haynesworth at center. I don't know if that answer comes from someone already on the roster. I don't know if they bring someone in. I don't know if it's a competition, but that is going to be really fascinating to me. I think the idea is, I actually don't know. You bring in Ty Thompson. I think the assumption is at minimum there's a competition, if not kind of expected that he takes on that starting role. Not to diminish anything from Kai Horton, but his pedigree alone makes you pause, being, I believe, the highest recruit that Tulane's ever brought into their building. But either one of those guys is going to have to be operating with someone new, snapping the ball to them under center. So I guess if you have someone transferring over, it doesn't really matter because that happens anyways. And that's always been such an interesting thing to me with the amount of quarterback transfers that you see is, okay, well, who's your center? And I mean, do you care about the fact that that's probably one of your more important relationships on the field? Just think back to when Michael Pratt came back for Tulane this year. Bringing Sincere Haynesworth with him seemed like a really necessary portion of that. Otherwise, you're really starting over from square one. But that's why you have spring camp, and that's why you get these things kind of hammered out. But I think having the quarterback room be settled for Tulane is so important. Trying not to jump all over the place, but I always just think about in the NFL where there are teams that really need wide receivers in free agency and during the year, but receivers care about who's throwing them the ball. I learned that very early on in my first year of fantasy football that Josh Gordon could be the best wide receiver there is out there. If Cleveland can't throw him a ball worth a damn, it literally doesn't matter. So having that quarterback room shape out, really important for that wide receiver group that Carter Sheridan is going to be tasked with coaching up, because that's really where I think you're going to see these guys start to transfer in at that position where you already had one over from UCF and Jalen Griffin, but you're losing that entire room, all things considered, at least your top three guys, and Chris Brazel, who transferred to Tennessee, and then Lawrence Keys and Jaquan Jackson going on to the draft. I went over that in my last podcast episode. That, was 40% of the targets this year, and your wide receivers 1 through 3 right there. So that's going to be really interesting to see how Tulane shapes up that room, but good to have a coach in there that is kind of moving back to his natural position. And so that's the kind of the coaching staff that's being retained. The other people, I don't know if it's a for sure thing yet. You think about Rob Green, who was the interim defensive coordinator for the Military Bowl. He was the anchor coach this last year. I don't know if he's being retained alongside JJ McCleskey, but again, you know that JJ McCleskey can handle his defensive backs. You're going to have a new defensive coordinator in Greg Gasparato. I hope I'm saying these names correctly. He's the defensive coordinator coming over from Troy. They're bringing over the inside linebackers coach as well, and Taylor Polk to coach those linebackers. So last year you had Sheil Wood be the defensive coordinator and the linebacker coach. Probably too tall of a task, all things considered. Maybe some guys can do it, but I just think it's kind of better to have position group coaches be where they are, despite that, again, that position group being a really strong point for Tulane this last season. You have Brock Hayes coming over from Troy to be the running back coach to replace Sheridan, who's taking over for Derek Sherman at wide receiver. I believe it's been reported that Evan McKissack is coming over to coach tight ends over from Troy. So I'm not sure what that means for Tyler Spots. The new offensive coordinator, also from Troy, Joe Craddock, and then their strength and conditioning coach coming over from Troy, Rusty Witt. And I'm really curious about him. He spent a lot of time in the military and just looks really hardo when you look up his pictures online. I recommend that everyone take a gander at that, but that's a lot of new coaches. And it was a lot of new coaches for Tulane last year. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. You replaced Chip Long at offensive coordinator with Slade Nagel. Or I guess it was Jim Svoboda in title. We can keep that up in the air of who was truly the OC of the Cotton Bowl year. But you lost John McMenamin as well at wide receiver coach. So that's where, Derek Sherman, who was coaching the running backs that year, moved over to wide receiver. And then you had Carter Sheridan come in and coach running backs. Then you had, I believe Tyler Spots came in to coach the tight end group after Slade Nagel moved more over to that offensive coordinator role, but I'm probably getting things really screwed up in my head here. Then you had to replace Chris Hampton at defensive coordinator. You did so with Sheil Wood. You lost Mike Moots at linebacker coach. You also replaced him with Sheil Wood. You lost the offensive line coach. You replaced him with Dan Rochar. You lost the defensive line coach. You replaced him with Gerald Chapman. All of that to say, And not to mention, you also lost special teams, so you replaced with Greg McMahon. I hope he's staying, but I'm not entirely sure at this point. But that's a lot of turnover on the coaching staff just from last year alone. What they had was the amount of returning guys on that roster. So there is going to be a lot of turnover. You've already seen, though, their ability to bring in guys from the transfer portal and do it the right way. Not going to get back into that conversation, but there were guys from Troy that entered the transfer portal, and now you're seeing them get offers for Tulane, but we are so far removed from the bowl season, and probably worked out just in everyone's favor. At least Tulane's, that Troy had that Birmingham Bowl on the 23rd, and it was over while we were literally all heading over. I was on the plane with Michael Arata and his son. I was sitting in the middle of them. We were all watching the Birmingham Bowl on our phones on our way up to Washington, D.C. for the Military Bowl. So that just works in Tulane's favor that that bowl game was out of the way first. And so once they started hiring all the coaching staff over, it wasn't leaving them high and dry for their bowl game. But you have already just the defensive backs that have transferred in the last couple of days or so have really just kind of stuck out to me. So you also had a defensive lineman transfer over from Troy in Deshaun Batiste. But you also have Caleb Ransaw, a defensive back coming over from Troy. And per Isaac Popper on Twitter, he had 51 tackles last year, 3 pass deflections, and an interception. You also have Jack, I believe it's Chinchu. I'm so sorry if I butchered that. That's one of those like Pettisclo that I'm going to have to really listen to him say and get it down because it's not spelled how I believe it's pronounced. He's another defensive back from Troy. You also have Jalen Geiger, a defensive back coming over from Kentucky. Then you have Chris Rogers, who's said that he's a safety online. His graphic came out with linebacker on it, and he's definitely one of those hybrids that could play in the middle of those two things, but assuming that he's moving over to linebacker, you have to really replace a lot of guys in the defensive back room for Tulane, where, yeah, they had to replace the whole middle of the field last year, losing Lummy Young, Larry Brooks, and Macon Clark, but you still had your cornerbacks in Lance Robinson and Jarius Monroe really rounding that out. You also had some veteran presence in guys like DJ Douglas and Bailey Despaney, who were sitting there on the depth chart and, played at times, but really stepped in well for those guys at safety. So you lose DJ Douglas, who's transferring over to Florida, and then you lose Cam Pettisclo at anchor because he's out of eligibility. He declared for the draft. Lance Robinson onto the draft, Jarius Monroe, and then they're kind of backup in AJ Hampton. So that's one of your starting safeties. You still have Bailey Despaney, your starting slot, anchor, nickel, corner, whatever you want to call it, and then your 2 outside cornerbacks and their backup. That's a tall hill to climb. So getting these defensive backs all coming in and just looking at their size. Size to me is something that's really underrated in that room. And you really saw it in Jarius Monroe being 6'2", 205, his ability to really play as a press man corner. And Lance Robinson at 5'11", 180 is just not going to be able to play the same way. So he played a lot more of that kind of off coverage of trailing and breaking on balls a lot more than kind of playing that physical line of scrimmage play. You got a little more of that out of AJ Hampton, who was kind of skinny, actually, 6 feet, 175, but had really good use of hands. I remember talking to him before the season started. He'd come over from Northwestern where they just play a lot of press coverage. And so just having the technique and the hands to be able to do that, that's half the battle. Cam Pettisclo is one of those guys that pound for pound is just all muscle. And at 5'9", 185, really didn't play like he was that size at all. But it sticks out to me that all of these guys that are coming over are on the bigger side, except for Jack Chinchu, who's 5'10", 182, kind of a similar size to Lance Robinson. But Jalen Geiger coming over from Kentucky, he's 6'1", 199. Chris Rogers, who's that hybrid linebacker safety, 6'2", 216. So that's where you kind of see that go over. And then Caleb Ransaw, 6'0", 197. And I had read that he played a lot of the time in the slot. So those are guys that are all over 6 feet tall, have decent weight. And that's something that is really going to matter for that defensive back room this year. So I'll be curious to see how that kind of shores out, because then you also have guys already there like Darius Swanson, Kevin Adams, who was a freshman that played really well in the Military Bowl. And so I'm really, again, looking forward to spring camp and seeing how that all kind of fares out. But you have Alex Bauman coming back in that tight end room. I don't know if Chris Carter has any eligibility left or not. I will do a roundtable episode of all of these things once I have the ability to really get all those notes down. But this is just kind of what I was able to get off of the top of my head in terms of guys that were leaving next year, and that just really standing out to me in that defensive back room more than anything else. I know that you're losing some guys on the D line, but Tulane really had a lot of depth there this last year and developing a lot of guys on that line that are sticking around. So some of them got some snaps in the Military Bowl. And I continue to go back to that being really the importance of those games of now those guys aren't necessarily going to get punched in the face by a regular season game next year. That's going to matter a whole lot more than the ending score of that Military Bowl. So I guess I really am seeing the value in letting those depth chart players play, especially if you think that, again, there's a chance that you can develop them into starters on this roster next season. So we'll kind of see who fares out of that group of younger guys that played in the Military Bowl. But I think it's safe to say Tulane had a lot more holes on defense last year, and they had that kind of consistency going on the offensive side of the ball. Yes, they lost Tajay Spears, but again, when you have most of your offensive line, if not the entire thing, save for left tackle, where Cam Wire played really well in place of Joey Claybrook, who was a left tackle from the Cotton Bowl year, you have 4 of your 5 starting O-linemen coming back, starting quarterback, starting the wide receivers that were remained from the year prior, and the tight ends as well. I know that they lost guys like Will Wallace and Tyreek James, but you also had a lot of guys on this roster like Reggie Brown and Alex Bauman who had considerable play time the season prior to that. And I just think when you have your quarterback and center returning, it makes everything a lot easier. So this year they're going to have Mekhi Hughes and Shoddy Clayton-Johnson, Arnold Barnes returning at running back. You can't ask for more than that room. And every offense to me starts and ends with a running game. So that's, if not the most essential part. I know quarterback is more important, but a quarterback to me is only as good as their ability to get a run game off. Yes, you have guys that can really throw outside of that, but when you're thinking about too, what translates to the next level, being able to operate a balanced offense is very important. The term game manager always has a negative connotation. I think about guys like Brock Purdy, who aren't doing the most insane things out there, but are executing an offense with playmakers in it and not trying to just be the hero. And so I'll be curious to see how Tulane really fares in schemes on both sides of the ball next year. So I know there's a lot of people that were fairly critical about Tulane's offensive production this last season. I think there are a lot of injuries that hamstring things a lot more than we realize. I don't think we'll ever really know what was ailing Michael Pratt or what is ever ailing Michael Pratt, how much that mattered. But I've talked about the injuries on the offensive line. I think they really performed well, all things considered. And then you started to see how razor thin the margin for error was when you started to lose an entire wide receiver room. Although I don't know any other program that would be completely unaffected by losing wide receivers, 2, 3, 4, because Chris Brazzell was still playing at the time, but really it was just him without Lawrence Keys and Jaquan Jackson. And then you just think about how all those wide receivers performed to start the year against South Alabama and those earlier games this year. But there was definitely periods where it lulled. And I know that people aren't happy about a 13-10 win against a 2-win ECU. That was a game where I think Tulane was in danger of beating themselves more than anything else. But as much as I talked about, like I said on the last episode, where blowout offenses really don't seem to matter that much in terms of continuing on. I know SMU might not be the only example, but that was really all this talk about this incredibly prolific offense, one that played pretty well against Tulane in that championship game. But it really doesn't matter that much at the end of the day. I do think that the ability to close games and win close matchups is just as, if not more important, but being able to score points equally as important as well. And you think that Tulane really wants to make a statement next year, especially having to have all that turnover, and especially at coming at quarterback and head coach. Those are really the paramount roles on a football program, and that applies to the NFL and college football. So whoever ends up being quarterback for Tulane, they're really kind of in this with John Sumrall as the new face of the Green Wave. But I just feel like Tulane is in the conversation now. They are a relevant national brand. I keep talking about this, but the fact that all but the FAU game this last year were on national television for Tulane, it really matters in being able to build that kind of brand where you think about the rise of programs like Cincinnati, UCF over these last couple of years. I remember reading this article about UCF really trying to work on building their national relevance and that familiarity. It is really important, especially when you're, a private school that's in the South in a behemoth of programs that include, LSU and all of the big schools that are down in the South of Louisiana. Being a small G5 program that's a private school that has an undergraduate population that is like a fifth of half of these other schools, perception nationally really matters. And so just having that consistency of being on national TV week after week, and then being one of those top teams, they are going to benefit from that, because the conversation next year, as much as college football might hate the idea of including G5s in the college football playoffs, and even if they end up voting on this model of 6+6 or 5+5 or 7, where, they're kind of having another temper tantrum about how many teams we let in the college football playoffs. The idea with the Pac-12 dissolving into whatever, they would be the ones left out of that. And so it would still kind of apply as the top ranked G5 program. And so, like it or not, they're going to have to follow along with programs like Tulane. And so perception and those kind of transfers, as much as it's stupid, it matters going into the year that you're able to pull in these high recruits like Ty Thompson and this coaching staff of really impressive hires from top to bottom. When you look at guys like Wilkerson coming over from South Alabama, he's one of the top Sun Belt recruiters, if not the top one, not to mention that they had the number 2 total defense in the Sun Belt last year and were top 3 in run in the last 2 years. That's, again, a really good resume coming over. And you just get the sense that every hire for Tulane has been very intentional. Every offer coming out has been very deliberate and intentional. And just being able to host guys like Shaz Preston, I believe, coming over from Alabama on official visits, Jalen Geiger from Kentucky, who ended up committing over to Tulane. These are SEC players coming for official visits at Tulane. And G5 or not aside, that is a wild statement to be saying about Tulane. And I just think it really credits John Summerall. It credits the legacy that the players and Willie Fritz have all built over these last few years. And it goes to show you that, you can walk into a successful place and make your mark without having to blow everything up and without having to, be that kind of extra about it. I think that John Summerall, he's both moved loudly and in silence at the same time, where the offers have been loud in the sense that these are knock out of the park players. And he's been making himself very present and available in the New Orleans area. And I have to shout out, the Pelicans and the Saints for kind of working in tandem with Tulane at this point. But it does help that there is a lot of Tulane alumni in the front offices of both of those buildings. But, having John Summerall's family be able to attend the Pelicans game and be on the Valley Sports broadcast with Jen Hale and be with Todd Graffinini, Tulane legend, on the radio broadcast for the Pelicans, that helps promote Tulane. And he kind of threw out in the TV interview that he had 10 or 11 grad transfer or, transfer portal guys that he was hosting that he had to go to dinner with afterwards. That's a lot of players in kind of the dead of January at this point. And then to go to the Saints the next day and be able to show that there are guys that he's worked with that have developed onto the next level, like Lynn Bowden, who came from Kentucky, who I believe was over there while John Summerall was a coach. And Troy has a player going to the Senior Bowl this year. So he has his own success, but he's coming into a place where he just has more resources. They have a little bit more momentum, I think. And like I said, if John Summerall had stayed at Troy, we might be talking about these as, in the flip, where they're the ones building more on the momentum and Tulane's kind of having to start back over. Tulane is starting over, but it doesn't feel that way. It just feels kind of like a new beginning. And sure, this could all come crashing down when we start to play the football games, but that's kind of what you're left dealing with in this offseason cycle. And all you can look at is the moves that have been made, how they've made them. And I think what that really says about the leadership coming top down for Tulane. And I think you've seen them do it the right way. I think you've seen it be very thorough and have due diligence really be applied. And as much as there was all of these holes on the coaching staff when I was just in DC a few weeks ago, everything is settled now, and it's the first week of January. So all things considered, I think this has been a crazy season to cover. And, we're still kind of covering the offseason as we head on to the draft and rebuilding Tulane. But as I've said, I've really gotten the opportunity to just have college football punch me in the face in a great way in terms of getting every experience possible, but really seeing how chaotic it can be in these times where the transfer portal is not your friend, signing day is not your friend, success at a G5 level is not your friend. But can you withstand those punches and keep going? And I think it says a lot about David Harris, about all the people involved in this hiring decision, and John Summerall's ability to withstand adversity walking in the door from day one on. I think that's really, when you ask me what's the phrase for it? Kind of what's the identity of Tulane? To me, it's fighters through adversity. And that's just kind of what it's going to always be like when you're a G5 team trying to compete with the big dogs. So the ability to withstand those hits, to me, it really builds character, it builds toughness, and that translates on to a football field that has one hell of a coaching staff as is. So the Senior Bowl is coming up later this month. I'm going to start again looking at the coaching staff a little more bit in detail, going back, probably watching some of Troy's offense and defense from last year, trying to get a sense of what it'll look like for Tulane this year. maybe checking out a little bit of Ty Thompson. But again, for this being the dead period of January, you really didn't have this much excitement for Tulane last year. It was more of, we just won the Cotton Bowl, oh my God, and let's just kind of let that dust settle for a while. But that didn't happen this year, and so you just got to keep rolling. And I think Tulane's future is rolling pretty bright right now.